Okay, pull this up a little closer here. Let's talk quick about chapters 1 through 3 and hit some of the high points really fast just to make sure we're all in the same place. Remember, the book takes place over the summer of 1922. And so if we think about chapter 1 being like June, we will see that the book will end with the coming of fall. Nick Carraway lives in West Egg. We define that there are two different neighborhoods, East Egg and West Egg. We're going to talk about the difference here in part of what we're going to skip. He lives next to Gatsby's house. And so Nick lives in what he calls a cardboard bungalow. It's a cheap little house that probably used to be servants' quarters for the bigger house. Daisy is Nick's cousin. She's married to Tom Buchanan. Nick knows Tom because they went to college together. They also get introduced to Jordan Baker. She's a pro golfer and a professional liar. In chapter 3, Nick gets invited to Gatsby's party and meets Gatsby while he's there. And some of the things that stand out to Nick are that Gatsby is unassuming. Because of the way that people have talked about him, because of his house, Nick expects this larger-than-life figure, this older person, and instead he meets a guy that's very similar to him. He's also a veteran of World War I. He does not know him from the war. I saw that in a lot of questions. That's because you can't read correctly. He says, and we talked about this, your face looks familiar, but he's not saying, hey, I met you here. It's the look that a veteran has. He says Gatsby's smile is a quality that stands out, and we're going to see that return to as we go. But Nick is intrigued about who Gatsby is. Even though he meets him, he still doesn't make sense to Nick. How does this guy get as rich as he does? How is he so normal? There are certain qualities about him that he wonders about. Why isn't he drinking? Why are there no girls around him? We're going to start to learn some things about Gatsby here in chapter 4. Jordan gets called away to speak to Gatsby one-on-one. And at the end of the party, she runs into Nick again and says she has heard the most amazing story, but she can't tell Nick. And she's specific about, I can't tell you yet. We will hear what they had to talk about. Thanks for being prepared. We're going to hear what they talked about here in chapter 4, but not today. We will get to that tomorrow. If you take a look at the opening of chapter 4, we're going to skip the first 2 pages or so. If you look at how it opens, Nick talks about the fact that, hey, lots of people came to Gatsby's house over the summer, and I wrote down some names of people that I saw. And if you just scan, you notice that the first, 6 paragraphs of the chapter are just names of people. They're not even real people. They're all fake people. So I didn't write the questions for this chapter because otherwise I would have left these off. So I'm just going to give you the answers. Number 1, if they don't know Gatsby, why do they come to his party? Well, we kind of talked about that last chapter. They come to use his house because he has docks, boats, all this fun stuff. They come to drink his booze because, again, remember, it's illegal at the time. And they come to eat his food. We talked in chapter 3 about all the different types of food he has laid out. Gatsby's parties are the place to be seen. And for people at the time, they want to be where people are going to see them. And so Gatsby's parties kind of have that attraction to them. So for question 1, there's your answer. We've got all these people here because they just want to be where it's cool. And they want to take advantage of the free stuff. The second question asks about the names. And it asks, hey, what should we notice here? So I'm going to just tell you what I notice. On the first one, they ask, hey, how do we know that the East Egg people are what we call old money? And we had talked about this difference. Old money are people who have had money their entire life. It's inherited money. So maybe their great-great-grandfather got rich, and it's just been passed down generation to generation. We notice some qualities here. The people from East Egg are described as old money. Well, they mention that someone went to Yale, which is where Nick went. And so there's that quality of, hey, I went to a really good school. He also describes that they have their noses in the air. They're better than everyone. They're stuck up. Now, people that live on West Egg tend to be what we call new money. They have earned their money or their prestige within their lifetime. Our more modern example of people that are new money are athletes. Athletes often come from a place where they don't have that money, they don't have that background, but they have a skill and they market that skill to make a lot of money. Notice that we talk about people from West Egg, they mention a state senator, they mention people that are involved in the movie business, and they also mention gamblers, people that would be able to earn their reputation, prominence, or money within just their lifetime. And so here are your answers for the first two questions. We're going to skip the first 2 pages roughly of the book, and you're going to look for the paragraph that begins at 9 o'clock one morning late in July. That's where we're going to pick up. Everybody with me? Everybody found where we're going to pick up? Chapter 4, about 2 pages in, the paragraph starts at 9 o'clock one morning late in July. So this chapter really breaks down into 3 major sections or movements. My hope is that we can get through the first 2 today, or at least 1.5, to set us up to be ready to go tomorrow. So as we start here, section 1 is going to involve Gatsby and Nick going to New York. They're going to go in Gatsby's car and take a car ride. As we're reading today, I want you to consider 2 things. First, we're going to hear a lot about Gatsby. So think about, what do we learn about him? But the bigger part, why do we as readers doubt what we hear? And this is something we're going to talk about a lot. Remember, Nick is our narrator. He's narrating this from the future. He's writing about the summer of 1922, but he's writing it in like 1924. So he's thinking back on it. And as he thinks back on it, he's going to color our perception of this meeting. And he's going to put doubt in our mind about why we don't trust Gatsby's story. Look for that. Nick says at 9 o'clock, one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its 3-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation, made frequent use of his beach. Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together. He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. Okay, so they take a while to talk about Gatsby sitting on this car. First, notice what he says to Nick. Do you think Nick knew he was having lunch with Gatsby that day? No. And so notice Gatsby shows up and is just like, hey, buddy, we're going to go have lunch. Okay. What word stands out to you when they describe Gatsby on the hood of the car? Restless. We come back to it again. He starts to point to it being American, but then he cements it by calling it restless. And we've talked about, for these people in the lost generation, they don't understand who they are. They don't understand their place in the world. And so that concept of being restless is almost like they just don't know what to do. And so we see that here in how he's standing. Yes?
Oh, you said the lost generation. How is their name?
Whose name?
You said people in lost generation.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean? Like,
we did all that work before we started reading the book. So that's a historical context thing. You should have that. So he's going to continue here. He saw me looking with admiration at his car.
Oh, yeah.
It's pretty, isn't it, old sport? He jumped off to give me a better view. Haven't you ever seen it before? Well, yeah, I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and toolboxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I talked with him perhaps 6 times in the past month and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded, and he becomes simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. Okay, if you notice, we just hit one of your questions. What makes Nick feel that sense of disappointment? It's that Gatsby doesn't open up. He doesn't seem to have anything to say. Remember, we've spent, up until we met him, about 2.5 chapters talking about this figure of Gatsby and building this mystery. And so Nick expected this like amazing figure, like we say on the cover, this great guy. And instead, Nick's like, he's kind of boring. Like he doesn't really talk much and he doesn't really have anything to say. He's going to have things to say today. So Nick goes on, he says, and then came that disconcerting ride. Hey, take a second. What's the word disconcerting mean? You've got a computer in front of you.
Anxious, confused, or embarrassed.
Yeah, anxious, confused, embarrassed. So are you getting a good feeling about what this ride to New York is going to be like? Think about here, we said, hey, why are we going to doubt Gatsby's story? Well, notice here, Nick says, and then comes this disconcerting ride. He doesn't say it's reassuring. He's already said that Gatsby disappointed him, and so this isn't going to help us much in how we're viewing him. Something about Gatsby's story here is going to make Nick feel weird. He says, we hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his eloquent sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. Look here, old sport, he broke out surprisingly. What's your opinion of me, anyhow? A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life, he interrupted. I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear. So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversations in his halls. I'll tell you God's truth. His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. I'm the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors had been educated there for many years. It's a family tradition. Okay, do we know where Oxford is? Oxford University is in England. It's one of the oldest universities in the world. And so here he's telling you, I was raised here, but educated in England. That takes a lot of money. That takes a lot of prestige. But look at what Nick's going to follow this up with. He says, he looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. So after saying it, his body language tells Nick, I shouldn't believe this. He hurried the phrase educated at Oxford, or swallowed it, or choked on it, as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces. And I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. Oh, what part of the Middle West? I inquired casually. San Francisco. I see. Why is that funny?
San Francisco is intelligent.
Yeah. So a lot of people have questions about this because they're like, okay, I understand why this would only support that he's lying. Some people chalk it up to Fitzgerald just trying to be funny here. Like that even Gatsby's trying to be humorous? We don't know. But we definitely have this moment of going like, that doesn't help this case at all. He says, my family all died and I came into a good deal of money. His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment, I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that, I lived like a young Raja in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that had happened to me long ago. Okay, what's a Raja? He uses the term here. He says, I lived like a young Raja, Rajah. Anybody know?
So like a prince in a room.
Like a prince, yeah. If you ever saw Aladdin, you know it. Because you're like, oh yeah, that's why that word rings in my head. So notice how he describes his life. Oh, I just traveled around and I lived in different places and I did things for myself. But notice he trumps it up. I was collecting rubies. I was doing, no, you weren't. So notice how Nick reacts. He says, with an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. Take a second and look. We just missed it. We just hit a question about that very sad thing. If you're somebody who's super rich and you have that, like, are you going to buy into this? Oh, I felt very sad for a while. Think about that reaction. And notice that Nick wants to laugh at him because it's kind of ridiculous. Here you are sitting in a car with this guy who's super rich and he's like, oh, I lived like a young Raja. I was collecting rubies and hunting tigers. And you're just like, yeah, okay. All right. The whole thing is ridiculous. And so when we look at, hey, why do we doubt this story? It's Nick's coloring of it. Nick describes it as disconcerting. Nick describes it, he wants to laugh at this. If all we had were Gatsby's words, we'd just be like, okay, I guess. I mean, you swear to God that you're going to tell the truth. Nick gives us this perception of, hey, there's something about this that's not right. Like, it seems like he's lying. It seems like there's all these pieces. He keeps going. Gatsby says, then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Forest, I took 2 machine gun detachments so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration. Even Montenegro, little Montenegro down on the Adriatic Sea. Okay, you have taken history this year. Are some of these names that he's mentioning sounding familiar to you? Like which ones?
Montenegro.
Huh?
Montenegro.
Montenegro. Why does that sound familiar to you? That's Montagues. Close. You might remember Montenegro from geography. If you don't, hey, you got a computer in front of you. Pop it up. Yeah, you'll kind of see where it is. You'll see how small it is. It's very unimportant here.
Wait. It says in the call.
Okay,
The whole country under Yugoslavia.
there you go. You might, the Argonne Forest might be familiar to you if you know your World War I battles, major battle. So he's giving us all this stuff and he's talking about, oh, I was even given a decoration, a medal. Okay? Notice how Nick reacts to him. Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. Okay, there's a question about this. Think about it. If you laid out a dozen magazines and you just skimmed them really quick, you didn't read the articles in depth, you just kind of looked at everything. Would you have an overview of a lot of topics? Especially if you had a dozen different magazines. Would you see a lot of different stuff? But would you feel like it's a lot of information and you might not believe it all? That's how Nick feels about this conversation, is that look at how Gatsby talks about the war. Oh, I went through this huge battle and I did all this great stuff and I got this award from this little country. Even though I'm American and I did all this stuff, Nick's like, there's so much here. Like, you're telling me that all of this is true? Like, his head's a little spinning, but he's fascinated by it now. Where he wanted to laugh at Gatsby, it's almost like, okay, what's the next lie going to be? What's next? Do you have a scepter? Are you the secret king of America? Like, what are you going to talk about next, dude? Like, this is ridiculous. And so now we change things up a bit. Gatsby reached in his pocket and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Ordiri de Danio, ran the circular legend. Montenegro, Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Major J. Gatsby, I read, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers, loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. And there was Gatsby, looking a little, but not much younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease with their crimson-lighted depths, the gnawing of his broken heart. Okay, I want to ask you about these things. So Gatsby produces two things to validate these stories that he's told, and I want you to just think about both. Let's start with the medal. How many of you know someone who has earned a war medal of some kind? Do they carry it around with them? No. Gatsby here flings this thing into Nick's lap and then is even like, turn it over, make sure to read the back that has my name on it. And then he pulls out a picture. Now, remember, it's 1922. You can't doctor photographs in the way that we think today. Gatsby's able to show a picture that is clearly in Oxford with him in it. Why does Gatsby have these two things in his pocket? Uh-huh. And why would he bring them today? He says he carries them around all the time. You think he does? Let's go back to the very beginning. Did Nick know he was having lunch with Gatsby today? So why does Nick want to throw some doubt on this story? Because this is a setup. Gatsby shows up at his house and says, hey, we're having lunch today. And then decides after all this time that Nick says, he didn't really open up to me. He was kind of a disappointment. Gatsby goes, hey, I'm going to tell you about my life today. And then he's throwing out all this stuff. Take a look at the next paragraph. Read it to yourself silently. This is where he talks. Actually, read the next couple. Finish the conversation just until they stop with the quotes. So you don't have to go any further than where it says, I hadn't the faintest idea. Just those couple of quotes there from Gatsby and Nick. Anybody need more time? Tell me what you notice.
Have tea with Jordan.
Huh?
Jordan. Nick was still have tea that afternoon with Jordan.
Yeah, Nick's going to have tea with Jordan. And notice what Gatsby has to say about it. What does Gatsby say is going to happen at this tea?
Jordan was going to speak about this matter.
Yeah. Notice the first thing, that first quote. He says, I'm going to make a big request of you today. So we said, this whole thing is a setup. And now we know why. Gatsby's going to ask Nick for a favor. But notice that he colors it in terms of, hey, before I even tell you that I'm going to ask you for a favor, I'm going to tell you my whole life story, and I'm going to produce these things to prove it. I want to make sure you have the right idea of me. But is Gatsby going to ask? No. Why is he going to use Jordan?
He loves her.
Okay, Nick loves her. So what? Why use her?
She's so good. Is she beautiful?
Why would Gatsby want to use a beautiful girl that Nick loves to ask the favor instead of just Gatsby asking it?
Will do it.
There you go. Think about it. It's that simple trick. I'm not going to ask you. I'm going to have your girlfriend ask you. That way it's harder to say no to her than it is just to me. So think about, why does Nick create this doubt in this conversation? Why does he give us these feelings? Because Nick is pissed off. Because he's like, you show up at my house, you take me to lunch, you feed me this story, you make me doubt it, and then you give me proof, and then you do this whole thing where you're like, oh, well, I'm going to ask you a favor, but I'm not going to do it. Your girlfriend's going to do it. Nick's not happy. Nick's a little upset here. He talks about it. He says, I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic. And for a moment, I was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. Let's take a second. We're going to read the next page silently of where this conversation goes as they move closer into the city. And you're going to notice it's going to involve a police officer. And so process, like what happens here, if you go down further, where we're going to stop is where it says it's one sentence as a paragraph by itself. Even Gatsby could happen without any particular wonder. That's where we're going to stop. So I'm going to give you some time to read this single page, and then we'll discuss. We'll see if we get any further today or if we stop there. So take a couple of minutes, read this page. Think about the police officer. What does that tell us? Anybody need more time with this? They good? All right, tell me about the police officer.
He wasn't there for very long at all
Why?
because of a picture that Nick showed him.
Nick didn't show it.
I'm sorry, not Nick, but Gatsby.
Yeah, what is it?
He thought it was the picture that Gatsby showed up from an officer.
Yeah, Nick thought that's what it is, but Gatsby tells him what it is.
The trading card,
From who?
the
I want you to think of this like a get out of jail free card. Gatsby's basically able to flash like, hey, I get Christmas cards from the police commissioner, leave me alone. And notice that the cop's like, sorry, pal, have a good day. Hashtag white privilege. So you notice, again, we add another wrinkle to Gatsby here. Another layer where Nick is still like, what? Like, how do you just get out of the police bothering you? The guy literally apologized to you. We create more of this mystery around who Gatsby is and what's going on here. And Nick is even more uncertain because what you should notice is Nick knows there's an ask coming today. Gatsby's going to ask for a favor. I don't know what it is. I don't know that I really want to do it because I don't trust it. And he's just like, oh, we're going to start the next part. We're only going to do a little bit just to kind of follow up on some of these things that we've talked about here. And so you notice that, I don't believe there's not a break in your text here, right? Your digital version of the book doesn't do breaks really well. But normally there would be a break here to kind of show, hey, we're shifting scenes. So they were driving before and now they're going to be inside. He says, roaring noon in a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar. I met Gatsby for lunch. Okay, I want to process that sentence for a second. How many of you have ever gone to lunch or any kind of a restaurant that's in a basement? Yeah, it's a little odd. Now, in New York, it's a little different. If you've ever seen even pictures of New York City buildings, you may notice that there's steps that go up, and sometimes there are windows that are just like below street level. And so it's not uncommon in New York. Here, we don't have basements because of the soil. But up north, basements are a pretty regular thing. And so a lot of times, you would have housing that's up here, and there would be a lower level that was either another apartment or sometimes a business or a bar. And so don't get weirded out where you're like, oh, this is creepy. But notice that he says it's noon and then follows in the next sentence to talk about how dark this place is. Okay. So we know that he's going into this place. It is dark. He says, blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked up obscurely in the anteroom, Gatsby talking to another man. Mr. Carraway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfsheim. A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with two fine growths of hair which luxuriated in either nostril. He has a mustache. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. So I took one look at him, said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. And what do you think I did? What? I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Catspaw, and I said, all right, Catspaw, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth. He shut it there and then. Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into a somnambulatory abstraction. Highballs? Asked the head waiter. Okay, do you know what a highball is? It's an alcoholic drink. Okay, so we got to think about this though. It's prohibition. Alcohol's illegal. So should a waiter be offering alcohol if they're at a restaurant? Are they at a restaurant? You know your history. If it's in a basement and it's dark and they're offering alcohol, where are they likely? What kind of bar? Did you talk about speakeasies? They're a speakeasy. These are private, secret bars that are often in basements and dark places hidden from the public where they would openly serve alcohol as though things were good. Now, we describe Mr. Wolfsheim here, and we describe him as being Jewish. Now, New York has a large Jewish community. We're going to talk tomorrow about who Mr. Wolfsheim is, why we're meeting Mr. Wolfsheim in a speakeasy where they shouldn't be, and what the purpose of this meeting is and why it's kind of there. But notice it's going to follow up on what we talked about today. Nick is uneasy about this meeting. He doesn't like it, and he feels like he's being played, and it's only going to continue. So we're going to put a pin in it there. We will finish the chapter tomorrow and set